The night was unusually still, as if the world itself had paused in anticipation of something unseen. A thick fog curled along the twisted paths leading to the manor, weaving through the skeletal branches of ancient trees. Each step the traveler took was swallowed by the mist, and yet, faintly, there came a sound behind him, a soft, deliberate echo of footsteps. He paused, heart tightening in his chest, listening. The footsteps matched his pace exactly, then quickened slightly as if testing his nerves. He turned abruptly, peering into the dense shadows, but saw nothing. Only the mist greeted him, and the cold bite of the wind, carrying a faint metallic tang that raised goosebumps along his arms. For a moment, he considered the possibility of another human lurking in the fog, yet the surrounding silence suggested otherwise. No voices, no rustle of clothing, no distant lantern glow. He was utterly alone, and yet, the feeling of being watched was suffocating. The manor loomed ahead, its silhouette monstrous against the darkened sky. Gothic spires pierced the low clouds like jagged teeth, and the stone walls, blackened by time, seemed to absorb the dim moonlight. Windows stared blankly, reflecting the traveler's nervous gaze, as though the house itself were observing him. He noticed the ornate iron gates, twisted and rusted, creaking softly with the breeze. Something in him warned against stepping closer, yet curiosity, or perhaps a morbid sense of inevitability, pushed him forward. Each step across the uneven path seemed to resonate unnaturally, and with each echo, the footsteps behind him grew clearer, sharper. He spun around again, breathing heavily, but the path remained empty. The sound persisted, unrelenting, rhythmic. It was not merely a noise, it carried a presence, a weight, a deliberate insistence that made his skin prickle. Inside the manor, darkness clung to the corners like a living thing. The massive double doors groaned in protest as he pushed them open, revealing a vast hall shrouded in shadow. Dust floated in the pale moonlight filtering through tall, cracked windows, forming ghostly patterns in the air. The floorboards beneath him groaned with each step, and he realized with a shiver that the sound of the footsteps behind him was now echoing inside the walls, impossibly synchronized with his own movement. Panic fluttered in his chest, a quick, frantic pulse, yet he forced himself to move further, drawn deeper into the manor's belly. Faded portraits lined the walls, faces frozen in stern, indifferent stares, their eyes seemingly following him, tracking every hesitant motion. The air smelled of damp wood, decay, and something else he could not name, something metallic, coppery, almost alive in its presence. He reached a long corridor where the darkness seemed thicker, almost tangible. The footsteps behind him stopped abruptly, leaving only silence, a silence so profound it seemed to press against his eardrums. He exhaled shakily, heart hammering, trying to convince himself it had been a trick of the night. Perhaps the fog had masked his own steps, or perhaps he had imagined it entirely. Yet the oppressive atmosphere left no room for reason. The traveler's instincts screamed that he was not alone, that the manor had been waiting, patient and immovable, for someone to disturb its ancient quiet. As he continued down the corridor, a faint sound emerged from one of the rooms, a soft scraping, almost like nails against wood, then the whisper of cloth brushing against stone. He froze, gripping the edge of a carved banister, ears straining for the next signal. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared at the end of the corridor, where a tall mirror stood against the far wall. The glass reflected the traveler's tense posture, wide eyes, and the pale sheen of sweat on his forehead. He stepped closer, feeling drawn to it, and as he did, the sensation of being followed intensified. The mirror's surface shimmered oddly, almost liquid in its reflection, distorting the familiar image of the hall. And then he saw it, behind him in the mirror, a shadow moved that had no shape in the room itself. It was subtle, fleeting, a slight shift, a dark ripple, but it was undeniable. The traveler spun around, heart leaping into his throat, but the hall was empty. Only the mirror held the truth of what his senses could not grasp. The footsteps returned, soft but insistent, circling, moving through spaces they could not occupy, always present yet unseen. A cold draft swept past, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a sigh, as if the manor itself had exhaled. The traveler's resolve faltered, his legs trembled under him, yet a compulsive curiosity propelled him forward. He leaned close to the mirror, examining the shifting shadows within the reflection. For a brief, impossible moment, he saw not only himself but fleeting glimpses of other figures, faces pale and anguished, eyes wide with fear, fleeting apparitions standing silently behind him. He staggered back, heart racing, as the sound of footsteps accelerated around him, weaving through the hall like a predator circling its prey. The air seemed to thicken, the silence punctuated only by the echo of movement that had no source, a rhythm both alien and intimately familiar. Time lost its meaning. The traveler felt suspended between fear and fascination, unable to leave yet desperate to escape. Shadows lengthened, twisted, and converged, and the footsteps became an oppressive force, pressing against his mind as much as his body. He turned in every direction, searching, hoping to confront the presence, but the manor remained an unyielding enigma. Finally, trembling and gasping, he stumbled into a small vestibule where a shattered window allowed the cold night air to rush in. The footsteps halted abruptly. Silence fell, complete and suffocating, leaving only the sound of his own ragged breathing. For what felt like hours, he stood frozen, unsure whether relief or terror should consume him. Then, slowly, impossibly, a single set of footsteps retreated down the hallway, fading into the distance. The manor returned to stillness, as if nothing had occurred, and yet the traveler knew otherwise. His mind had brushed against something ancient and inexplicable, a presence that moved beyond the boundaries of reality. As he stumbled toward the door, leaving the shadows behind, the distant echo of footsteps followed him out into the night, a haunting reminder that the manor did not easily relinquish its secrets. That night, under the cold gaze of the moon, the traveler understood the truth: this house, this place, had been waiting for him, and it would follow anyone who dared enter, lingering long after they thought they were gone. The manor's history stretched back centuries, its stones soaked with the stories of those who had built it and those who had suffered within its walls. Constructed in the late 1600s by a wealthy landowner whose ambition exceeded his sense of caution, the estate was designed to impress, to tower over the surrounding countryside as a testament to power and legacy. Each spire and carved cornice spoke of prosperity, yet beneath the grandeur, the foundation was laid upon land whose past was far darker than its outward appearance suggested. Before the manor existed, the site had been a small burial ground for the local villagers, a place meant to honor the dead, their graves marked only by simple stones and the occasional iron cross. Legend held that the restless spirits of this ground had been disturbed, their repose shattered by the weight of wealth and human arrogance, and though this was whispered among the locals, few dared speak it aloud. As the decades passed, ownership of the manor changed hands frequently, each new master adding their own touches to the estate while oblivious, or indifferent, to the tales that clung to it like ivy. Expansive wings were added, ballrooms decorated with gilded chandeliers, and long galleries lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow visitors as they walked. Despite the lavish improvements, the whispers persisted, growing louder with each generation. Servants spoke of cold drafts in sealed rooms, of objects moving without explanation, and the faint, fleeting sound of footsteps where none should be. These reports were often dismissed as overactive imaginations or the natural settling of an old house, yet the records, letters, and diaries left behind suggested a recurring pattern: every family that moved and eventually experienced disturbances that no rational explanation could fully account for. During the manor's earliest years, some of the accounts were more tangible. A young governess, for instance, described being awakened by the unmistakable sound of a man's boots pacing the hallways at midnight, only to find the corridors empty. A decade later, a guest attending a lavish gathering noted that his shadow appeared to move independently of his body, a fleeting but disconcerting presence in the candlelight. Each incident, recorded in meticulous detail in journals and letters, suggested a house alive with its own consciousness, one that observed, manipulated, and perhaps judged those who crossed its threshold. The manor was not merely a building, it was a vessel of accumulated energy, shaped by ambition, greed, sorrow, and, some feared, malevolence. Over time, the manor gained a reputation beyond the immediate village. Travelers passing through recounted stories of inexplicable chills, of voices whispering in empty corridors, of lights flickering without cause. Rumors of spectral figures were frequent, a lone woman in period dress wandering the halls, a child crying in a long-abandoned nursery, and, most disturbingly, the sound of footsteps echoing relentlessly through rooms that had no living occupant. Each story layered upon the last, creating a dense, almost palpable aura of unease that clung to the estate like a shadow. Even those with no inclination toward the supernatural found themselves unnerved by the manor, its mere presence affecting their mood, their sense of reality. Visitors described an almost sentient quality in the house, a weight pressing on their minds, as though the walls themselves remembered every transgression committed within. The architecture of the manor contributed to this sensation. High vaulted ceilings created vast, echoing chambers where sounds traveled unpredictably. Narrow hallways twisted at odd angles, creating blind corners that could conceal movement. Hidden staircases and servant passages, intended for practical use, instead became conduits for fear and speculation. A sudden creak from a floorboard above, the subtle shift of a curtain in a draftless room, the faint metallic scrape of a lock, all could suggest the presence of someone else. The manor, in its grandeur, had inadvertently cultivated the perfect conditions for the eerie to flourish. Even the most rational observer would find it difficult to reconcile what they saw and heard with the simple mechanics of an old building. Yet there were moments of beauty that contrasted starkly with the unsettling reputation of the estate. Sunlight streaming through leaded windows painted intricate mosaics upon the marble floors. Gardens meticulously maintained revealed glimpses of serenity and order amidst the sprawling wilderness of the surrounding land. These glimpses of innocence and human endeavor seemed to exist in tension with the darker, unspoken truths of the house. The interplay of light and shadow, of order and chaos, became almost symbolic of the manor's nature, a space where grandeur and dread coexisted in uneasy harmony. It was precisely this contrast that made the estate so compelling, drawing in those who sought beauty, prestige, or merely a story to tell, while simultaneously warning them of the hidden depths beneath its surface. Documentation from the 18th and 19th centuries shows that while the aristocracy and wealthier residents reveled in the manor's splendor, the servants often bore the brunt of its peculiarities. Accounts detail inexplicable accidents, objects moving without warning, and the pervasive sensation of being watched. Some described waking to find rooms rearranged overnight, with furniture shifted in ways that seemed deliberate. Others recounted whispers in languages they could not recognize, or shadows stretching unnaturally across walls. Over time, these experiences became normalized for those living within the manor's walls. They were no longer surprises, but rather part of the daily rhythm of life in a house where the ordinary and the inexplicable were inseparably intertwined. By the turn of the 20th century, the manor had earned a reputation as both a marvel of architecture and a place of subtle terror. Letters, diaries, and local folklore painted a picture of a house that resisted understanding, one whose mysteries could not be fully unraveled. Scholars of the supernatural and curious adventurers alike were drawn to the manor, eager to glimpse the phenomena firsthand. For many, it was not merely a building, it was a living testament to the weight of history and the unseen forces that accumulate over centuries of human activity. The manor existed in its own temporal space, a nexus where ambition, sorrow, and fear converged, shaping the events and the people who dared to enter. In the early decades of the 20th century, the manor welcomed a new pair of inhabitants, a young couple seeking the promise of a fresh start far from the bustling towns and cities. Their arrival was marked by hope and excitement, the sort of optimism only newlyweds could possess, unaware of the shadowed history that clung to the estate. They were drawn to the manor's grandeur, the elegance of its towering spires, and the sprawling gardens that had once been meticulously tended. The house appeared, at first, to be a sanctuary, a private retreat from the outside world. Yet within weeks, that initial serenity began to fracture, as the subtle, almost imperceptible disturbances began to reveal themselves. The first signs were small, almost trivial: a door left ajar despite being firmly shut the night before, objects slightly out of place, the faint cold draft of air in rooms that had been sealed for days. These minor anomalies, easily dismissed, were the manor's quiet way of announcing its presence. The couple, eager to settle into their new life, attributed the occurrences to the quirks of an old house. Yet even as they attempted to rationalize the events, the disturbances grew more insistent. At night, the hallways echoed with the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, precise and deliberate, yet entirely disconnected from any living being. At first, the footsteps were sporadic, an oddity that could be ignored. Then they became relentless, following the couple from room to room, a phantom cadence that matched no pattern the human mind could fully comprehend. Sleep, once a refuge, became an ordeal. The young woman awoke repeatedly to the sensation of being observed, shadows shifting in corners where none should exist. The man heard whispering, soft and unintelligible, seemingly emanating from the walls themselves. The couple's attempts to confront the phenomena only seemed to provoke the house further. The air grew heavier, colder, and the sounds more frequent. Each creak of a floorboard, each soft thud, became charged with menace. What had begun as minor oddities now asserted themselves with an undeniable presence, as though the manor itself were watching, waiting, and testing the resilience of its new occupants. The once bright anticipation of starting their life together now wavered beneath the oppressive weight of unseen forces. As days turned into weeks, the couple's daily routines were disrupted. Meals were abandoned when an inexplicable noise erupted in the kitchen. Conversations halted mid-sentence as shadows seemed to slither across walls, subtly shifting with no identifiable source. The man began to notice his wife's growing anxiety, her wide, darting eyes betraying the fear she tried to conceal. And yet, the young woman herself began to notice changes in her husband. Once calm and rational, he became irritable and restless, often muttering under his breath about movements and sounds that she could not perceive. The manor, it seemed, had begun to manipulate not only the environment but also the minds of those who dared to inhabit it, subtly eroding their sense of reality, one creeping disturbance at a time. Then came the most disturbing phenomena. On several nights, both would awaken to find the faint outline of a figure standing silently at the foot of their bed, indistinct yet undeniably human in form. It would vanish the moment they called out or attempted to approach, leaving only the residual chill in the air and the echo of footsteps fading into the distance. One evening, as a storm raged outside, they explored the upper corridors of the manor, drawn by a persistent creaking sound. In a long, narrow hallway lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors, the young woman saw movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow gliding silently along the wall, yet when she turned fully, the corridor was empty. The footsteps, once merely unsettling, now seemed purposeful, a calculated manifestation that left no doubt the house's disturbances were deliberate and conscious. Friends who visited were often unsettled as well. They reported hearing sounds in rooms the couple claimed were vacant, feeling cold drafts brush past them, and sensing an almost sentient presence. Yet the couple found themselves unable to articulate the depth of the fear, as if speaking aloud would somehow give it form, make it permanent. The manor, with its history of watchful walls and whispering corridors, fed upon their hesitation, their attempts to explain, their very need for rationalization. Over time, they began to question not only the nature of the phenomena but also their own sanity. Doubt crept in, insidious and unrelenting, leaving both exhausted and on edge, their nights spent in vigilance, their days in tension. During this period, personal items began to vanish and reappear in impossible locations. Letters left on the desk would later be found in a distant wing. Keys misplaced in the living room would turn up in the attic. Books would fall from shelves, seemingly in protest, while the young woman sometimes heard her name whispered in the dead air of empty chambers. Each event was a reminder that the house observed them, anticipated them, and moved with a purpose that they could not decipher. Attempts to set up boundaries, locking doors, marking objects, or attempting to map the sounds, proved futile. The manor's influence was subtle, relentless, and entirely beyond the control of its human inhabitants. By the third month of their residence, the psychological weight of the manor was undeniable. The couple's conversations were dominated by reports of strange sounds, shadows, and sensations. Sleep became rare, fragmented by the persistent disturbances. The young woman occasionally claimed she saw figures in mirrors that weren't there, reflections that did not align with reality. The man began recording his observations in a journal, detailing the precise timing and nature of the noises, yet he remained uncertain if he was documenting real events or succumbing to paranoia. Friends and local residents began to advise them to leave, citing the manor's reputation for unrest. But attachment, pride, and curiosity kept them rooted, a dangerous decision that allowed the house to continue its slow psychological assault. Eventually, the couple began to realize that the footsteps and noises were not random. They followed patterns, sometimes synchronized to their own movements, sometimes lingering in anticipation. It became increasingly clear that the manor was not simply haunted by past residents, it possessed a consciousness that responded, observed, and interacted. This revelation did not bring relief but instead magnified their fear. The young couple now faced the undeniable truth: the manor was alive in ways beyond human comprehension, and their lives, their sanity, were being tested in ways they could neither predict nor control. The house had established itself as more than a residence, it was an omnipresent force, a silent observer, a manipulator of both space and mind, and they had unknowingly become part of its enduring legacy. The townspeople had long been aware of the manor's unsettling reputation, though most had learned to speak of it only in hushed tones. It was not fear alone that silenced them, but also respect for the ancient and enigmatic forces that seemed to inhabit the estate. Tales of the manor were passed from generation to generation, whispered at market gatherings, during church services, or around hearths on long winter nights. Children were warned to avoid the winding paths leading to its gates, their imaginations filled with stories of wandering spirits and vengeful shades. The elders spoke of misfortune visiting those who dared to enter without reverence, of families disrupted, of unexplained deaths that left communities puzzled and silent. To the townspeople, the manor was both a monument and a warning, a place of elegance and horror, a relic of human ambition haunted by unseen consequences. According to the legend most often recounted, the house was built atop the resting place of a servant wronged by the original landowner. This servant, a young man named Elias, had been unjustly punished for an accident that was not his fault. In life, he had been loyal, diligent, and quietly observant, yet betrayal and cruelty had marked his final days. In his last moments, it was said, he swore vengeance on all who would inhabit the manor, a promise that extended beyond his mortal existence. The townspeople insisted that his spirit lingered, tethered to the estate, growing more restless and powerful with each new inhabitant who unknowingly trespassed upon the site. Stories of footsteps echoing in empty halls, whispers drifting down corridors, and shadowed figures appearing in mirrors all traced back to this fateful grievance, a spectral inheritance born of injustice. Families who had resided in the manor before the young couple experienced similar phenomena, though few dared document their encounters in detail. Servants, in particular, left the estate in haste, unwilling to endure the mounting disturbances. One housekeeper described the sensation of being followed relentlessly through the hallways by invisible presences. Plates would slide from shelves, doors slammed without cause, and whispers would erupt in languages she could not comprehend. A tutor recounted waking in the middle of the night to find the nursery in complete disarray, though no living hand had touched a single object. Each account was marked by fear, bewilderment, and the slow, creeping understanding that the manor's disturbances were neither random nor innocent. The estate seemed to operate on its own logic, its actions deliberate, purposeful, and responsive to the living. Despite these warnings, the manor continued to attract residents, drawn by wealth, ambition, or curiosity. Each new inhabitant entered with optimism, only to encounter the same sequence of anomalies: doors that opened and closed without warning, cold spots in sealed rooms, and, most disconcerting of all, footsteps that echoed precisely when no one else was present. At times, these phenomena were subtle, objects slightly out of place, shadows that lingered at the edge of vision, but gradually they became undeniable. The townspeople observed from a distance, often offering advice that was politely ignored. "Respect the house," they would whisper, "and do not disturb what you cannot understand." The manor, they seemed to suggest, was a living entity, one that demanded acknowledgement and caution rather than challenge. There were also more sinister stories. One merchant's son had reportedly vanished after a night spent exploring the manor with friends. The boys had been daring each other, daring the house to show its true nature. Only the merchant's son never returned, and when the townspeople searched the manor at dawn, they found his belongings neatly placed in a room no one claimed to have entered. The other boys, traumatized and silent, refused to speak of what had transpired. From such incidents, the townspeople derived their own understanding. The manor did not act out of cruelty for its own sake, but its sense of justice and judgment was incomprehensible, often leaving devastation in its wake. Visitors were reminded that the house observed intentions, weighing curiosity against audacity, and responding accordingly. Religious influence also played a role in shaping perceptions of the manor. Priests and clergy would occasionally be summoned to bless the estate, yet even sacred rituals seemed to have limited effect. Some townsfolk believed that the disturbances were divine punishment for the original injustices, a lingering curse that no prayer could fully resolve. Others insisted that Elias's spirit had grown too strong over the centuries, fed by successive acts of neglect and arrogance from those who resided within the manor. Churches in the region often recorded prayers, rites, and even accounts of visions during masses dedicated to the manor's protection, yet all noted a consistent theme: the house defied complete understanding, and its influence remained persistent, subtle, and often terrifying. The local legend also included peculiar warnings about mirrors and reflections. According to oral accounts, those who stared too long into the glass within the manor's walls risked glimpsing not only their own image but also fleeting forms of the restless spirits inhabiting the estate. Shadows could detach themselves from walls, figures could appear behind glass without physical presence, and reflections could move independently, a spectral warning of the manor's awareness. For the townspeople, these were not simply fanciful tales but recorded observations corroborated by multiple witnesses over generations. Children grew up hearing that the manor's mirrors were windows into a world that overlapped with the living, a subtle reminder that the house's influence extended beyond ordinary perception. Over time, the legend became more than cautionary storytelling, it became a framework through which the community interpreted the manor's disturbances. When strange noises echoed through the streets on moonless nights, when animals behaved unusually near the estate, or when families experienced unexplainable misfortune, the manor was often cited as a source. Its presence loomed in the collective consciousness, a reminder that some histories could not be erased and some injustices could not be reconciled by mere human effort. The young couple, arriving unaware of these warnings, stepped into this complex web of observation and superstition, placing themselves directly within a narrative shaped by centuries of fear, curiosity, and reverence. By the time the couple began to sense the manor's unusual activity, the townspeople had already framed the events within their understanding of the supernatural. They spoke of echoes from the past, of a spirit's enduring vigil, of a house that judged and responded to those who dared live within its walls. These stories, passed orally and occasionally recorded in journals and letters, created a tapestry of caution and dread. For the townspeople, the manor was more than a house, it was a testament to the consequences of injustice, a repository of memory and intent, and a stage upon which the living and the spectral inevitably collided. Months had passed since the young couple moved into the manor, and the disturbances had grown in both frequency and intensity. Their accounts, once dismissed by friends and neighbors as nerves or imagination, had begun to attract attention from those with a more investigative inclination. A small team of paranormal investigators, known for their methodical approach to unexplained phenomena, arrived at the manor one crisp autumn afternoon. They carried equipment unfamiliar to the couple: cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, motion sensors, and EVP recorders. Each piece of technology, while scientific in appearance, was intended to capture events that defied ordinary explanation. The investigators were cautious but confident, trained to observe without immediately jumping to supernatural conclusions, yet the history of the manor suggested they would encounter challenges unlike any they had faced before. From the moment they crossed the rusted iron gates, the investigators sensed an atmosphere charged with anticipation. The wind whispered through the gnarled trees surrounding the estate, carrying the faint scent of decay and cold stone. Shadows clung unnaturally to the edges of the path, and the manor itself seemed to loom taller, more imposing than any architectural record could convey. They moved deliberately, setting up their equipment throughout the ground floor, cameras in the hallways, sensors in the rooms where the couple had reported the most activity, and recorders positioned near doors that were known to open and close inexplicably. Each step inside the manor was accompanied by the subtle groan of aged wood and the occasional distant creak of a floorboard, noises that could be attributed to structural settling but, in context, carried a weight of foreboding. Night fell, and with darkness came the first signs that the investigators were not merely observing the manor but interacting with it. A camera in the main hall captured a sudden flicker of movement, a shadow crossing the room where no one was present. Motion sensors triggered repeatedly, showing activity in corridors left completely empty. On the EVP recorders, faint whispers could be heard, soft, almost imperceptible at first, rising and falling in tones that defied any known language. The investigators convened in the central library to discuss their findings. Skepticism remained among them, but the accumulation of anomalies made denial increasingly difficult. It became apparent that the manor was responding to their presence, as if it recognized new inhabitants and sought to make itself known in unmistakable ways. One investigator, a woman experienced in psychological profiling of haunted locations, noted the atmosphere's effect on the team. She observed heightened tension, subtle tremors in voice and posture, and the creeping awareness that the manor's influence was not limited to environmental phenomena but extended to the human mind. Even rational, trained individuals began to feel the weight of the house pressing against their thoughts. Conversations were interrupted by sudden chills, as though invisible hands brushed across shoulders. Doors opened and closed seemingly of their own accord, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways with a precision that suggested observation and intent. Every new anomaly deepened the sense that the manor was an active participant, not a passive backdrop for investigation. As the night wore on, the team split into pairs to cover different wings of the manor. One pair entered the upstairs corridor, where the young couple had reported the most persistent activity. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. A sudden draft extinguished a lantern, plunging them into darkness. In that moment, a soft but deliberate set of footsteps began in the hallway behind them, pacing steadily. They spun around, flashlights cutting through the blackness, but the corridor was empty. The steps continued, circling the area, moving in a rhythm that was both precise and unnerving. When they attempted to call out, the only response was a faint, almost sorrowful sigh, echoing down the length of the hall and fading into silence. The investigators felt a chill that went beyond temperature, a sensation that their very presence was being acknowledged, measured, and tested by whatever inhabited the house. Meanwhile, another investigator discovered peculiar changes in the manor's layout. A hallway they had mapped earlier seemed subtly altered. Doors led to rooms they did not remember entering, furniture appeared rearranged, small objects were displaced in ways that were neither random nor consistent with human intervention. The pervasive sensation of being observed grew stronger. Shadows seemed to move independently, lingering at the periphery of vision. The air carried an almost imperceptible vibration, like the pulse of a heartbeat, echoing throughout the manor's vast expanse. Even those who prided themselves on objectivity were compelled to note the disquieting synchronization between the house's movements and their own actions. The manor was, in effect, alive, not in a biological sense, but as an intelligent, responsive force with an agenda of its own. As the investigation progressed into the early hours of morning, the team reconvened to review the evidence. Cameras had captured fleeting figures that vanished upon closer inspection. Motion sensors had triggered repeatedly in empty hallways. EVP recordings revealed whispers that defied interpretation but carried unmistakable emotional resonance, fear, longing, and perhaps warning. The team began to theorize that the manor's disturbances were not arbitrary but deliberate, shaped by centuries of accumulated energy, emotion, and perhaps unresolved grievance. One investigator proposed that the manor itself acted as a guardian of its own history, manifesting phenomena to communicate or even test those who entered. Another speculated that the house's architecture, the labyrinthine corridors, hidden stairways, and vaulted ceilings, amplified natural occurrences, producing effects that felt supernatural but had rational explanations. Yet none could reconcile these scientific theories with the tangible, oppressive presence they all felt. The young couple, observing the team, were both relieved and terrified. Relief came from knowing that others could witness the disturbances and corroborate their experiences. Terrifying, however, was the realization that the Manor's power was undeniable, even against individuals who approached it with skepticism, expertise, and technology. No equipment, no methodology, seemed sufficient to fully contain or explain the phenomena. The investigators themselves were humbled, facing a reality that challenged the very boundaries of their understanding. The Manor, ancient and resolute, had demonstrated that its influence was both immediate and persistent, affecting the living in ways that were subtle, psychological, and profoundly disturbing. By dawn, the Manor had grown quiet once more, leaving only the lingering impression of its presence. The investigators packed their equipment, exchanged weary and contemplative glances, and acknowledged the limits of their understanding. They left the estate with evidence, recordings, and notes, but no answers could fully satisfy the questions raised by their night within the Manor's walls. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing the twisted silhouette of the estate bathed in early sunlight. Yet even in the clarity of morning, the Manor maintained its air of silent observation. Those who left could not shake the feeling that the house had marked them, had recorded their intrusion, and would continue to watch long after their departure, patiently awaiting the next intruders who dared to cross its threshold. The investigators, having documented an array of inexplicable occurrences, began to sense that the Manor was far more than a haunted house. It was as though the building itself carried an unseen presence, one that observed, reacted, and perhaps even anticipated human behavior. As they reviewed the evidence gathered during their initial night, a pattern emerged. The phenomena were not random but seemed to respond directly to movement, attention, and intent. Footsteps echoed precisely where no living person walked, objects shifted when eyes were diverted, and shadows appeared to linger longer in areas where curiosity was most intense. The house, it seemed, was not merely inhabited by spirits but was a sentient force, capable of exerting its will on those within its walls. Delving deeper into the Manor's history, the investigators uncovered diaries, letters, and estate records detailing encounters with an unseen entity over several centuries. Descriptions varied in detail but shared common threads: footsteps in empty halls, glimpses of a dark figure in peripheral vision, and the sensation of being closely watched. One journal recounted the experience of a servant who described a pair of glowing eyes following him through the Manor's west wing at night, the lights retreating only when he fled in terror. Another account, from the late 1800s, detailed a governess who awoke to find the nursery in disarray, a rocking chair moving slowly back and forth with no visible cause. In each case, the presence was described as deliberate, as though it sought to be observed while remaining untouchable. These records, written long before modern equipment or scientific methodology, suggested that the Manor's disturbances were neither fleeting nor subjective. They were consistent, purposeful, and enduring. The investigators began to theorize about the nature of this entity. Unlike the spirits typically documented in folklore, which often had identifiable motivations or connections to past lives, the Manor's presence appeared to transcend human logic. Its actions were not revenge-driven in the conventional sense, nor were they random manifestations of grief or lingering attachment. Instead, the disturbances seemed to operate on a more complex plane, as if the house itself had absorbed the intentions, fears, and ambitions of its countless occupants and transformed them into a persistent, sentient energy. Doors would creak open precisely when attention waned, footsteps would follow only the unsuspecting, and shadows would shape themselves into forms that seemed to watch and evaluate. The team concluded that the Manor was not merely haunted, it was alive in a manner that defied ordinary comprehension. This realization marked a turning point in their investigation. Whereas initially they had approached the Manor with curiosity and a desire for empirical documentation, they now understood that the estate actively engaged with those who entered it. The psychological impact of this knowledge was immediate. The investigators noticed subtle changes in their behavior, heightened anxiety, vigilance, and an almost compulsive awareness of their surroundings. Equipment became secondary to perception, listening, observing, and noting the faintest irregularities were as crucial as recording data. The Manor's presence exerted itself not only on the physical environment but also on the minds of those who sought to analyze it, blurring the lines between observation and participation. Further examination of the Manor's architecture revealed elements that likely enhanced these experiences. Hidden staircases, narrow passageways, and labyrinthine corridors created a sense of disorientation and confinement. Vaulted ceilings amplified footsteps and whispers, making them seem larger, closer, more purposeful. Mirrors, strategically placed in long hallways and rooms, reflected more than light, they reflected the presence of the unseen, offering fleeting glimpses of figures that did not belong. The investigators noted that certain rooms seemed to pulse with activity at particular times, while others remained eerily still, suggesting a selective awareness within the house. It was as though the Manor itself had developed an understanding of human perception, exploiting weaknesses in attention and expectation to maximize the impact of its presence. The psychological toll on the investigators became increasingly evident. Sleep deprivation, heightened adrenaline, and the constant awareness of being observed led to tension and irritability. Even those with extensive experience in paranormal research reported feelings of dread, paranoia, and dislocation. One investigator described the sensation of walking through a room only to realize, moments later, that the footsteps they heard were not their own, but had moved ahead of them as if predicting their path. Another noted a cold sensation at the back of the neck, followed by a subtle whisper that seemed to communicate a warning rather than a threat. These interactions, while subtle, reinforced the sense that the Manor was not merely a passive backdrop but an active participant, capable of influencing perception and eliciting emotional responses with precision. Documents uncovered in the Manor also contained references to hidden chambers, secret compartments, and symbols etched into walls and floors, often in obscure or ancient languages. The investigators speculated that these features could be linked to occult practices or rituals, possibly intended to contain or channel supernatural forces. If true, the Manor's sentient disturbances might have been influenced, or even created, by human intervention centuries earlier. This possibility added a layer of complexity. The entity they were confronting could be both the product of centuries of human ambition, fear, and ritual, and a self-sustaining intelligence that had evolved beyond any one lifetime. The investigators began to realize that what they were observing was not a traditional haunting but a complex interaction between history, architecture, psychology, and energy, a force that had grown exponentially with each century. As nights progressed, the team documented increasingly aggressive phenomena. Footsteps no longer followed only the investigators' movements, they began to appear in rooms where no one was present, sometimes echoing from above or below simultaneously. Objects shifted with deliberate intent, often appearing in locations that conveyed messages or suggested warnings. Shadows moved in patterns that could not be explained by natural light or the movement of individuals. Even the most skeptical members of the team began to acknowledge that the Manor possessed a will of its own, one that combined intelligence, memory, and a sense of observation that surpassed conventional understanding. The unseen presence was no longer a subject of study alone, it had become a tangible influence on thought, emotion, and action, a force that demanded respect and caution. By the conclusion of their intensive investigation, the team reached a consensus: the Manor's entity was unlike any conventional spirit or ghost. It was an amalgamation of centuries of human presence, architectural manipulation, and perhaps ritualistic intent, manifested as a sentient, responsive force. Their recordings, journals, and observations provided evidence of the phenomenon, yet none could fully comprehend the magnitude of the Manor's influence. The house did not simply haunt, it interacted, evaluated, and responded, shaping the experiences of those within according to its own unknowable logic. The investigators left the estate profoundly altered, aware that the presence they had encountered was neither fully understood nor easily dismissed. The Manor's unseen inhabitant had revealed itself, not through overt malevolence, but through the subtle, persistent demonstration of power, intelligence, and observation that lingered long after they had departed. The couple, alongside the investigators, began to consider explanations beyond the supernatural. They sought rational frameworks to understand the phenomena, turning to science, psychology, and historical context in an attempt to grasp the Manor's relentless disturbances. One theory proposed that the house's age and architecture could account for much of what was experienced. The ancient floorboards expanded and contracted with temperature and humidity, creating noises that echoed in the labyrinthine corridors. Hidden drafts, caused by deteriorating ventilation systems and cracks in stonework, could produce chilling cold spots in rooms sealed for decades. Mirrors, reflecting candlelight or lanterns, could generate illusions of movement in the periphery of vision. Shadows, manipulated by the interplay of light and architectural angles, could appear as figures to a mind primed for fear. These explanations offered partial relief, suggesting that perhaps the phenomena were rooted in physics rather than spirits. Yet the scientific perspective quickly met its limits. Despite controlling environmental factors, the investigators observed events that could not be explained by natural causes alone. Objects moved while unattended, sometimes defying gravity or appearing in locations far from their original positions. Footsteps echoed in rooms that had no physical connection to each other, as if traveling through invisible corridors that existed outside the constraints of the house's layout. Attempts to isolate and monitor the activity using cameras and sensors captured anomalies that could not be attributed to mechanical failure, human error, or environmental shifts. Even the most skeptical team members had to acknowledge that a rational framework, while partially illuminating, could not fully account for the Manor's persistent and precise interventions. Psychological factors were also explored. Could sleep deprivation, heightened stress, and fear be amplifying ordinary sounds and sensations into phenomena perceived as inexplicable? The investigators documented the mental and emotional state of the couple, noting that their anxiety often coincided with the escalation of disturbances. Yet this explanation proved insufficient. Footsteps, whispers, and objects moving occurred independently of observation, recorded on multiple devices when no human presence was nearby. Shadows appeared on camera in ways that defied both logic and known environmental effects. The Manor seemed to respond not only to physical presence but also to attention, intention, and expectation. The psychological explanation, while relevant to understanding human perception, could not alone account for events verified through multiple objective means. Historical research offered another layer of insight. The Manor's construction atop a previous burial ground and the accounts of injustices inflicted upon servants suggested that the disturbances might be tied to unresolved grievances from the past. Diaries and letters detailed repeated patterns, each generation experienced similar events, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, objects moving without explanation, shadows appearing at the periphery of vision. In each account, there was consistency across time, implying a continuity that transcended individual perception. The Manor itself, through architecture, memory, and perhaps energy imprints, seemed to preserve these events, allowing them to manifest for future inhabitants. Historical context provided a plausible explanation for the Manor's persistence and selectivity, hinting at a form of consciousness or memory encoded within the building itself. The team considered combinations of factors, environmental, psychological, and historical, as a possible unified explanation. Perhaps the Manor's design amplified ordinary noises into eerie phenomena, while psychological stress heightened sensitivity, and historical echoes provided thematic consistency. Yet even this comprehensive approach left gaps. Some events were so precise, so contextually aware, that they suggested intention. Footsteps followed paths perfectly aligned with human anticipation. Shadows avoided detection, moved deliberately, and seemed to observe the living. Objects were displaced in ways that conveyed messages or warnings, not random disorder. These anomalies hinted at agency within the Manor itself, something that blended the physical, psychological, and historical into a coherent but unfathomable intelligence. The investigators documented their findings meticulously, understanding the importance of distinguishing between explainable occurrences and those that defied logic. They created detailed charts, noting the time, location, and type of disturbance. Patterns emerged. Activity was often synchronized with human movement, attention, or expectation, suggesting that the house not only reacted but predicted behavior. The more the investigators attempted to observe without engaging, the more the disturbances adjusted, evading detection and asserting a presence that was active rather than passive. This awareness, an intelligence beyond their comprehension, suggested that the manor was not merely haunted but interactive, capable of learning, responding, and manipulating its environment with subtle precision. By the end of their investigations, the team acknowledged the limits of both science and reason when confronted with the manor. While many phenomena could be partially explained through environmental factors, psychological responses, and historical context, a significant portion remained elusive. The house had demonstrated an intelligence, a presence that could not be fully contained by rational frameworks. The investigators realized that attempting to categorize the manor solely as haunted, psychological, or architectural was inadequate. It existed in a complex intersection of all three, with an agency that defied complete understanding. The couple, observing the investigators' work, felt both relief and unease. Relief came from the acknowledgement that others could witness the anomalies and validate their experiences. Unease stemmed from the realization that the manor's influence could not be fully controlled or predicted. Rational theories provided partial comfort but also highlighted the impossibility of fully mastering or escaping the house's effects. The manor was no longer simply a residence, it had become an active participant in their lives, a force that transcended conventional explanation, blending past and present, perception and reality, in ways that would continue to challenge those who entered its halls. As weeks turned into months, the manor's influence began to exact a more profound toll on the young couple. The subtle disturbances they had once tolerated now escalated into an almost constant pressure, a psychological weight that seemed to follow them into every room. Footsteps no longer merely echoed down hallways, they tracked them from room to room, appearing simultaneously in spaces they had yet to enter. Doors slammed with calculated force, objects moved in patterns that suggested intent rather than randomness, and shadows lingered where the light could not penetrate. The house's presence was no longer a curiosity, it was an oppressive force, shaping their emotions, thoughts, and interactions. The couple found themselves increasingly isolated, unable to confide fully in friends or neighbors without being dismissed as hysterical, which only deepened their vulnerability. Sleep deprivation became the most immediate and devastating effect. The couple awoke repeatedly to the sensation of being observed, to whispers they could not understand, and to sudden, inexplicable chills. The young woman reported seeing figures in peripheral vision, always at the edge of awareness, never fully visible, yet undeniably present. The man experienced auditory phenomena that seemed to anticipate his movements, as if the manor itself were reading his intentions. Nights became a blur of tension, vigilance, and apprehension, with every creak of the floorboards or flicker of a candle threatening to unveil another layer of the house's mysterious presence. Over time, their once stable perception of reality began to warp, creating an ongoing state of unease and hyper-awareness that left them both physically and mentally exhausted. Social interactions outside the manor offered little reprieve. Attempts to discuss the ongoing disturbances were met with skepticism, ridicule, or polite concern, reinforcing a sense of isolation. Friends and acquaintances suggested stress, imagination, or the natural quirks of an old house, all of which, while partially valid, failed to account for the precise and intentional nature of many events. The couple began to realize that the manor did not merely disturb their environment, it had become the center of their psychological universe. Their thoughts and reactions seemed to be anticipated and manipulated, leaving them constantly second-guessing their own perceptions. Even rational explanations provided only partial solace, as the evidence of observation and intentionality remained undeniable. As the couple's mental state deteriorated, the manor seemed to escalate its influence in subtle, almost theatrical ways. Objects were rearranged to block passage or to guide attention toward specific areas. Footsteps would quicken or slow to match the rhythm of the couple's own movements, creating a disorienting, mirrored reality. Whispered voices, sometimes mournful, sometimes warning, emerged in rooms that had been previously silent, vanishing the instant the couple attempted to approach. In one particularly unsettling instance, the young woman awoke to find the entire library's collection of books meticulously stacked on the floor, forming a pattern that suggested letters or symbols. The couple, already frayed by weeks of disturbances, felt that the Manor's actions were purposeful, almost communicative, delivering messages they could neither interpret nor ignore. Their isolation intensified as the Manor's psychological impact deepened. Even in daylight, the house's presence was inescapable. Shadows appeared sharper, corners seemed darker than warranted by natural light, and air movement carried faint, inexplicable whispers. Ordinary activities became exercises in vigilance. Walking down a corridor required attention to the subtleties of sound and light, opening a door involved anticipating possible responses from an unseen intelligence. The couple's conversations increasingly revolved around their observations, suspicions, and strategies for coping, leaving little space for normal domestic routines or relaxation. The Manor, it seemed, had become both the subject and the controller of their daily existence, dominating perception and dictating behavior. Attempts to leave temporarily provided no relief. Upon returning, the couple reported that the house seemed to remember their absence, its disturbances picking up precisely where they had left off. The Manor appeared to track their routines, learning patterns, and adjusting its manifestations accordingly. Footsteps that had once been random now occurred in predictable locations, as if designed to evoke tension at specific moments. Shadows shifted deliberately, and objects moved with an uncanny awareness of attention. The young couple came to understand that the Manor's influence was not confined to individual rooms or time periods, it extended throughout the house and permeated the very fabric of their perception, leaving them in a constant state of heightened anxiety. Historical records discovered by the investigators suggested that this escalation was not unusual. Previous inhabitants had reported similar experiences, describing months or even years of gradual psychological strain that culminated in emotional collapse or abrupt departures. Servants frequently abandoned their positions, unable to withstand the sustained tension. Guests sometimes left in fear, never to return. The Manor, it seemed, had perfected a methodical, slow-burning influence, combining subtle physical disturbances with psychological manipulation to achieve maximum effect. The young couple now found themselves caught in the same relentless pattern, experiencing a phenomenon that was at once ancient, calculated, and terrifyingly personal. By the time they reached the height of this escalation, the couple recognized that the Manor was no longer a passive backdrop. It was a living entity, or at least a repository of intentional energy, capable of responding to, manipulating, and observing its inhabitants. Their sense of agency had eroded, replaced by a constant awareness that the house anticipated their actions and exploited their fears. Rational explanations offered partial understanding, but could not mitigate the profound psychological weight imposed by the estate. The couple had become participants in an ongoing, centuries-old cycle, one in which the Manor observed, judged, and subtly controlled all who dared to reside within its walls. After months of escalating disturbances, the Manor's presence began to dominate the couple's lives entirely, shaping every decision, every movement, and every thought. The subtle intrusions that had once been merely unsettling had grown into a persistent, almost oppressive force, leaving little space for normalcy or reprieve. Walks through the hallways became exercises in caution, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light, every whisper of air was interpreted as intentional, a communication from the house itself. The couple began to feel that the Manor observed not only their physical presence but their intentions, their emotions, and their innermost fears. Even when alone, the sensation of being watched remained, pervasive and unrelenting, as if the walls themselves were alive with consciousness. Friends and acquaintances, though sympathetic, offered little help beyond advice to leave. Their skepticism, tempered by concern, was rooted in the impossibility of understanding fully the Manor's influence. Attempts to explain the events rationally, citing structural quirks, drafts, or psychological stress, were only partially convincing, as the phenomena defied easy categorization. Shadows moved independently of light, footsteps echoed precisely in empty spaces, and objects shifted in ways that suggested deliberate intention rather than randomness. The couple realized that any attempt to rationalize or predict the house's behavior was futile. The manor operated according to its own logic, one that transcended conventional understanding and left those within its walls perpetually off balance. Isolation compounded the psychological strain. The couple increasingly avoided social gatherings, preferring the relative safety of private observation. Yet even in isolation, the manor's presence was unavoidable. Hallways seemed to stretch longer than possible, doors opened to reveal rooms that had not existed moments before, and mirrors reflected more than mere images, showing shadows that did not align with physical reality. The couple's sense of time became unreliable, with hours passing unnoticed while they attempted to monitor the house's movements. Days blurred into nights, and nights into a continuous cycle of vigilance and anxiety. The estate was no longer a residence, it had become a labyrinth of observation and influence, a domain where the couple's reality was dictated by forces beyond their comprehension. The psychological impact intensified when the couple began to perceive a deliberate pattern in the manor's activity. Footsteps and whispers seemed synchronized with their movements, appearing to respond to hesitation or curiosity. Objects were displaced to draw attention to particular areas, creating a sense of narrative or communication that defied explanation. Shadows shifted to anticipate motion, lingering just beyond the edges of vision, compelling the couple to react. The realization that the manor's disturbances were purposeful, rather than arbitrary, heightened their sense of unease. They no longer experienced random discomfort, they were participants in a carefully orchestrated interplay between observation, influence, and control. Attempts to establish boundaries proved futile. Doors were locked, yet creaks and thuds continued, objects were monitored, yet rearrangements persisted, attention was diverted, yet shadows and footsteps continued unabated. The manor had learned to anticipate and adapt to the couple's strategies, adjusting its manifestations in ways that reinforced its presence and power. It was as though the house itself were conducting an experiment, measuring reactions, evaluating responses, and refining its methods. The couple's attempts to assert control only confirmed the intelligence embedded within the estate, leaving them to navigate a space that was simultaneously familiar and alien, comforting and menacing. Historical accounts provided a haunting context for these experiences. Previous occupants had described similar escalations, the gradual intensification of phenomena leading to isolation, fear, and eventual departure. Servants abandoned positions, guests fled after brief visits, and families sometimes fractured under the psychological pressure. Patterns persisted over centuries, suggesting that the manor's influence was neither accidental nor temporary. Each generation experienced disturbances that grew in complexity and intensity, indicating a continuity of purpose and an intelligence that transcended individual lifespans. The young couple now understood that they were caught in the same enduring cycle, confronted by a force that had honed its methods through centuries of observation and repetition. The couple's own attempts to document the phenomena mirrored the meticulous approach of the investigators. Journals were kept, noting the precise timing and location of disturbances, as well as emotional and psychological responses. Observations were compared and analyzed in an effort to discern patterns or predict activity. Yet the manor continually defied these efforts. Footsteps and sounds appeared in unpredictable sequences, objects moved in ways that suggested foresight, and shadows maintained an awareness of human observation. The estate had become both subject and agent, a living system that integrated perception, expectation, and response into a seamless, haunting orchestration. By the height of this period, the couple realized the manor had achieved a degree of psychological dominance. Their lives were measured against its rhythms, their thoughts influenced by its presence, and their emotions manipulated through subtle yet relentless means. The estate no longer existed solely as architecture or history, it had become an active participant, a sentient force with the ability to shape reality within its domain. Rationality provided partial understanding, yet failed to diminish the pervasive anxiety and tension that defined life within its walls. The manor's influence was absolute, a slow-burning force that combined observation, manipulation, and anticipation to ensure its continued dominion over all who dared reside within it. As the manor's influence continued to tighten its grip, the couple found themselves increasingly estranged from the outside world. Friends and neighbors who had once offered sympathy gradually withdrew, uncertain how to respond to events that defied comprehension. Every interaction outside the estate left the couple with the uneasy realization that the manor's presence could not be communicated or contained. Rational explanations, while partially comforting, failed to capture the precision and persistence of the phenomena they endured. Shadows moved with calculated awareness, footsteps echoed in empty spaces, and objects were displaced in ways that seemed designed to elicit fear, curiosity, or reflection. The estate had become an omnipresent force, one that dictated their environment, thoughts, and emotions with subtle but undeniable authority. Isolation became the couple's only refuge, yet within the manor, there was no true safety. Every room contained its own disturbances, each corridor a trap for anticipation and anxiety. The couple learned to navigate the estate with caution, their movements deliberate, their attention hyper-focused on subtle cues. A creak in a floorboard, a flicker of candlelight, a faint draft, each signaled the potential presence of the unseen force that governed the manor. Ordinary domestic tasks were transformed into exercises of vigilance. Opening a door, lighting a lamp, or walking through a hallway required awareness of both the physical and the psychological landscape. The house's influence was relentless, embedding itself in the minutiae of daily life and creating a pervasive tension that seemed impossible to escape. Psychological strain intensified as the couple attempted to interpret the manor's purpose. Footsteps and shadows seemed synchronized with their own actions, objects were arranged to convey patterns or messages, and whispers emerged in rooms previously silent. The couple realized that the manor's disturbances were not arbitrary, they were intentional, responsive, and, in some sense, communicative. Rational inquiry offered no clarity, leaving only observation, interpretation, and cautious adaptation. The house had become an intelligent presence, capable of reading behavior, predicting responses, and manipulating perception to maintain its dominion. This awareness forced the couple to confront the possibility that the manor itself possessed consciousness, or at least a form of intelligence beyond human understanding. Historical records supported this unsettling conclusion. Previous inhabitants had documented similar experiences, gradual escalation of phenomena, heightened psychological strain, and eventual withdrawal from the estate. Servants abandoned their posts, visitors fled after brief exposure, and families fractured under the relentless pressure. These patterns, repeated across generations, suggested that the manor's influence was not accidental or ephemeral. It had developed methods of observation, manipulation, and psychological dominance that endured over centuries. The young couple now realized they were participants in a long-standing cycle, subject to a force that had honed its effects over countless years, adapting to the fears, habits, and behaviors of those who resided within its walls. Attempts to assert control proved futile. Locked doors remained vulnerable to subtle intrusions, objects moved despite careful monitoring, and shadows responded to human attention with disconcerting precision. The couple understood that the manor's influence extended beyond the physical realm, it shaped thought, anticipation, and perception itself. Even in moments of silence, the sensation of being observed persisted, a constant reminder that the estate's presence was active and aware. Rational explanations, while useful for understanding partial phenomena, could not account for the deliberate, responsive, and intelligent nature of the disturbances. By this stage, the couple's daily lives were defined by vigilance and adaptation. They monitored movement, tracked sounds, and documented each occurrence, attempting to predict the house's patterns. Sleep remained scarce, and every interaction with the manor carried an undercurrent of apprehension. The estate's influence was both overt and subtle, blending sensory disturbances with psychological manipulation. Footsteps, whispers, and shadows became extensions of the couple's own consciousness, a mirrored reality in which the boundaries between self and the house blurred. The estate was no longer merely a residence, it had become an active participant, shaping experience, guiding attention, and imposing its will with a precision that defied human comprehension. Even rational observers acknowledged the difficulty of reconciling these phenomena with conventional understanding. Scientific equipment documented anomalies, yet could not explain intent or intelligence. Environmental factors accounted for partial occurrences, yet failed to capture the deliberate nature of movements and patterns. Psychological stress influenced perception, yet objective documentation confirmed events independent of human observation. The manor existed in a complex intersection of architecture, history, psychology, and perhaps intelligence, producing a continuum of phenomena that was consistent, purposeful, and psychologically profound. As days passed, the couple understood that leaving the manor would not fully sever its influence. The estate's memory, accumulated over centuries, persisted in ways that affected perception and expectation. Even outside its walls, awareness of the manor lingered, shaping thought, influencing emotion, and casting a shadow over daily life. The house had transcended its physical structure, existing as an active, persistent presence that continued to define reality for those it touched. The young couple now lived in a state of constant adaptation, navigating a space that was both familiar and alien, controlled yet intelligent, historical yet immediate. By the time the couple reached the final months of their residence in the manor, the cumulative psychological and physical effects had reached an intensity that left them perpetually on edge. The subtle disturbances that had once seemed isolated had become a continuous, inescapable presence. Footsteps, whispers, and shifting shadows accompanied them through every room, creating an environment in which normal life was nearly impossible. Even mundane tasks, preparing meals, tending to chores, or simply walking from one room to another, were accompanied by a heightened awareness of the unseen. The house no longer felt like a structure of stone and timber, it had become an omnipresent force, capable of observing, responding, and shaping the couple's perceptions at every moment. Attempts to rationalize the occurrences proved increasingly futile. Scientific explanations for creaking floorboards, shifting temperatures, or drafts could only account for a fraction of the activity. Shadows moved in ways that defied the natural interplay of light, appearing and vanishing in patterns that suggested deliberate intent. Footsteps echoed with precision, responding to movement and attention in ways that suggested awareness. Even the most skeptical observers, including investigators who had documented and studied the manor extensively, admitted that a level of intelligence or agency seemed embedded within the estate itself. The couple came to understand that they were no longer passive residents but participants in a dynamic system that had been perfected over centuries, one that integrated observation, manipulation, and psychological influence into a single, cohesive presence. Historical accounts, discovered in journals and letters from previous inhabitants, painted a chilling picture of continuity. Families who had lived in the manor before them described months or years of escalating disturbances, followed by mental exhaustion, dislocation, and abrupt departure. Servants abandoned their duties, visitors fled in fear, and entire households fractured under the weight of the estate's influence. These accounts suggested a persistent methodology, a pattern of behavior that had endured across generations. The manor did not act randomly, it had perfected techniques to elicit maximum psychological impact, combining subtle environmental manipulations with deliberate and responsive phenomena. The young couple now realized that they were living within a legacy of control that had been carefully maintained for centuries. As the couple documented their experiences, they noticed a level of intentionality in the manor's actions that surpassed anything they had previously encountered. Objects moved to form shapes or patterns, shadows aligned with human attention, and footsteps anticipated movement before it occurred. Whispers, faint and often indecipherable, seemed timed to evoke fear, curiosity, or reflection. The estate operated with a precision that suggested a kind of intelligence, one that could observe, learn, and adapt to the behaviors of its occupants. Every response from the manor felt purposeful, a message or test delivered through the manipulation of environment and perception. The couple understood that they were being evaluated continuously, as if the house itself were an ancient sentinel, measuring their reactions and adjusting its methods accordingly. Attempts to resist or escape the influence proved difficult. Even when venturing outside, the couple felt the lingering weight of the manor's presence, an almost magnetic pull that extended beyond physical boundaries. Within the estate, their movements were monitored and subtly influenced, attempts to control or contain disturbances were consistently thwarted. Doors locked and unlocked without explanation, objects rearranged despite careful attention, and shadows persisted in their inexplicable movements. Rational strategies offered partial understanding but could not diminish the sense of surveillance and manipulation that defined every moment within the house. The couple's reality had been reshaped to conform to the manor's rhythm, leaving them acutely aware of the estate's enduring control. Over time, the couple reached a reluctant acknowledgement: the manor's power was not simply disruptive but absolute within its domain. It had evolved beyond mere haunting, transcending the boundaries of physical phenomena to operate on a psychological and perceptual level. The estate had become both environment and entity, a living system that incorporated architecture, history, and human consciousness into its ongoing influence. Rational thought, scientific inquiry, and personal resilience could only mitigate the impact to a degree. The manor's intelligence and persistence ensured that it remained the dominant force in the couple's existence. The final weeks of their residence were marked by careful adaptation. They maintained detailed logs, monitored movement, and observed patterns with the hope of predicting the house's responses. Even so, the manor remained unpredictable in subtle ways, capable of eliciting fear, reflection, or tension at precisely calculated moments. Each day was a balance between vigilance and survival, an ongoing negotiation with a presence that was at once historical, psychological, and intelligent. The couple understood that the manor was not simply a place to leave behind; its influence would follow them, lingering in perception, memory, and the subtle shaping of thought, long after they had vacated its walls. By the time they departed, the young couple left with a mixture of relief, dread, and awe. The manor had demonstrated an intelligence and persistence that surpassed conventional understanding, embedding itself within both their environment and their consciousness. Its presence was enduring, a complex interplay of observation, manipulation, and historical resonance that left lingering questions about the nature of perception, memory, and the unseen forces that might inhabit the spaces we call home. Even in leaving, they understood that the manor's legacy would endure, its influence persisting for the next occupants, quietly observing, testing, and shaping reality in ways that remained as mysterious and profound as the house itself. After the couple's departure, the manor retained its silent dominion, as if the events of months past were but a brief interlude in its long history. The estate stood weathered yet imposing, its presence both tangible and intangible, commanding attention from anyone who approached its gates. Neighbors reported the familiar creaks and groans of the old structure, sounds that seemed to carry meaning, even if it was unknowable. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the house, recounting stories passed down over generations, accounts of footsteps in empty halls, whispered voices that vanished when approached, and shadows that lingered where light could not penetrate. The manor's reputation had grown into legend, a living testament to the persistence of its influence, quietly shaping perception and expectation in all who dared come near. Investigators, both amateur and professional, continued to explore the estate, documenting phenomena with the same meticulous care as those who had come before. Cameras captured fleeting movements that seemed to anticipate human attention, sensors recorded anomalies in ways that defied conventional understanding, and EVP devices captured whispers that were often incomprehensible yet emotionally resonant. Each new visitor encountered a combination of physical, psychological, and perceptual disturbances, consistent with centuries of historical accounts. The manor had established a pattern of engagement, demonstrating an intelligence that was selective, responsive, and persistent, leaving those who entered with a sense of awe, unease, and curiosity. The architectural design of the manor remained central to its influence. Hidden staircases, labyrinthine corridors, and vaulted ceilings continued to create an environment of disorientation and heightened awareness. Mirrors and reflective surfaces amplified shadows and suggested movement where none could be seen. Rooms that had once been silent now contained subtle disturbances, shifts in air, faint sounds, and impressions of movement, demonstrating that the estate's presence was pervasive, even in areas previously considered inert. The house's design, coupled with centuries of accumulated energy and attention, produced an ongoing interaction between environment and perception. It was no longer just a building, it had become an intelligent participant, capable of shaping experience and eliciting responses from those who entered its domain. Over time, folklore surrounding the manor became intertwined with recorded history, creating a layered narrative that was difficult to disentangle. Legends of ghosts, spirits, and unseen entities merged with documented accounts of psychological strain, architectural anomalies, and unexplained events. Scholars and historians noted the consistency of phenomena across decades, suggesting a continuity that could not be explained by coincidence or simple structural quirks. The estate had developed a presence that transcended individual perception, a persistent influence that combined observation, interaction, and subtle manipulation of human expectation. Each new story, each documented encounter, reinforced the manor's reputation as a sentient and enduring force. Visitors often reported a sensation of being observed even when alone, a presence that seemed both patient and deliberate. Footsteps echoed in hallways that were otherwise empty, objects moved subtly to convey patterns or messages, and shadows appeared to respond to attention in ways that defied conventional logic. The manor's influence extended beyond physical disturbances, it shaped thought, emotion, and perception, leaving visitors aware of a presence that was intelligent and persistent. This combination of architectural manipulation, historical resonance, and psychological impact created an environment in which ordinary expectations of reality were challenged, and the boundary between observer and observed became increasingly blurred. Local historians noted that the manor had maintained this influence for centuries, adapting to the needs, fears, and behaviors of its occupants. Generations of inhabitants had experienced escalating disturbances, culminating in withdrawal, relocation, or mental strain. The estate's intelligence, subtle yet formidable, had preserved its legacy through careful and selective engagement, ensuring that each new occupant became part of an ongoing continuum. Observers, whether casual visitors or professional investigators, were drawn into this rhythm, participating unwittingly in a centuries-old pattern that was both precise and unpredictable. Ultimately, the manor's legacy was one of enduring mystery. Its presence combined architecture, history, and psychology into a single, persistent entity, capable of shaping perception and influencing those within its walls. Stories of its influence persisted across generations, blending legend and documented experience, creating a narrative that defied simple explanation. Even after the couple's departure, the estate remained a force that could not be ignored, a living testament to the power of place, memory, and unseen intelligence, quietly observing, testing, and shaping the world in ways that remained as enigmatic and profound as the manor itself.